Welcome to Motivating Your Supervisors to Give It to You Straight, sponsored by the American Bar Association. Moderating the program today is Kathy Morris. Kathy is founder of Under Advisement Limited and former director of career counseling and placement for Northwestern University School of Law, former director of the ABA Career Resource Center and the Center for Continuing Legal Education. She has decades of experience with guiding law students, lawyers, and law firms, focusing on attorney training and professional development. Kathy, you may proceed with the program.
Thank you, Bonnie. Hello, everyone. Happy and hopefully warm New Year to you all. Joining me today on our Career Advice Live program are a couple of gurus in the field. You're really going to enjoy hearing from them. You've got their bios if you've got your slides in front of you. It's interesting because both Steve and Sue have worked inside law firms and they've advised firms and individuals as consultants. And they also offer a lot of programs. One of the things that they've always focused on is what we're talking about today, which is getting and using feedback. Sue ran her own company first, and then she joined Bingham as director of the firm-wide professional development. Steve, the opposite, he held the same type of role in firms including Sherman and Sterling, Wilmer Hale, and now he is the principal and firm leader. So they have a slew of advice for you. I know it's going to be interesting and hopefully fun. You see my bio. I've been the moderator for the entire series and will continue to be. Hopefully this isn't your first Career Advice Live program, nor hopefully it will be your last. Quickly today, we're going to use the program format that we like for these webinars. We're going to have a really fun and quick faculty discussion, but you can always send your questions in. We'll see them, we'll choose them, and so forth. We may not get to all of them, but we're going to get to as many as we possibly can. We're going to change the pace when we do quick tips. We're going to have audience questions peppered, not just waiting till the end. As I mentioned, we're going to do an agree-disagree moment where the two speakers take a look at the statement that you'll see and they'll agree or disagree with it and tell you why. They have takeaways that are practical, and then there's some ABA information on the resources. I want to remind you to stay on, and you'll see a evaluation pop up after the program, and we really would love your feedback. So let's get now to the sort of the context of the program. When we talk about feedback, we're not talking today about the formal performance review that you may or may not have in your organization, but we think, the advice holds for that interaction as well. But we're really talking about feedback as you work on assignments, when you're taking that assignment, if you have interaction while you're working, after the assignment, after the engagement, and so forth. And in our view, feedback can be in person, as you see. It can even be, when you're walking down the hall with someone, and that's why I say on the fly. But we hope that it's going to be positive feedback and constructive feedback. We want to talk to you about how you can help foster that. That's why we focus on motivating your supervisor to give it to you straight, but in a way that you can use the information and use it in the short term and on an ongoing, professional development basis for yourself. So let's take a focus on the top issues. I'm going to leave this slide up for a bit so you can see, the kind of things that we're going to be talking about throughout. And so let me, kick off by, I'll ask you, Steve or Sue, who wants to kick us off, on the plus side, positive side, a couple of the quick thoughts you have on what people should do in seeking feedback effectively at their jobs.
Well, thanks, Kathy, and really happy to be here with you today and with Steve. One of the best practices, and of course this is coming from a seasoned career counselor, is that if you want to get more feedback, you need to know your own development goals. You just have to be aware of what you're working on in order to get it within your habits to ask for feedback on those particular skills or knowledge bases or progressions that you're trying to focus on. The more self-aware you are of your personal career goals, the more likely it is you will ask for feedback and the more likely that a supervisor can target it effectively.
Yeah, it's not like, often people think no news is good news, but, we want you to have news and we want you to use it, good and bad.
No news is rarely good news.
Steve?
I agree entirely with that. And let me add one, perhaps even two, very quick tips to that. I would also suggest developing the habit of asking for feedback, not about what you have done, but also looking for opportunities to ask for what you might think of as feed forward. That is, advice and guidance about options for handling a task or a conversation or a document that you're working on. And the key there is to offer up a specific question, or even better, offer up a couple of options that demonstrate that you've thought things through. For example, I haven't dealt with Jill before. You have. Does she prefer to deal with issues by email or by phone? Does she like lots of detail or just the bottom line? Or I've tried two versions of the story and this preliminary statement for a brief. Could you take a quick look and tell me what you think? If you get into that habit, it shows a certain kind of ambitiousness, a kind of forward-looking, and it fits attitude and fits directly with Sue's point too, that it shows that you're focusing on specific developmental goals rather than just kind of an open-ended way asking, how did I do? The other tip I'll make very, very quick, don't ask for feedback only from supervisors. It's not a sign of weakness to ask for feedback from others who have seen you in action. The best feedback I ever got about my communication skills or lack thereof in my early years came, in fact, from the secretary who sat outside my office and had to listen to me try to communicate inartfully. So find lots of people who can give you feedback.
Yeah, that's interesting. And, it doesn't even have to be somebody in your organization, right? As I'm listening, someone you meet at a bar meeting or someone you've, worked with before that knows you. Is that right? I mean, I do think we think of feedback as in the office feedback. Can it
That's
be
right. Even
broader?
family members and people who know us well, friends, can often understand our quirks better than we do, and can help us understand how what impact those quirks, communication quirks or interaction quirks, have when we're talking to another person.
Okay, I want to ask you the flip side, both of you, but I let me preface it this way. Steve, when you were talking, for example, you were saying, it's not a sign of weakness, ask a lot of questions, be feedback forward. I know some people are worried that they're going to be told or get feedback that they're too dependent on their supervisor, that they ask too many questions. I mean, how do you find the line? And I guess the question I have is sort of under the rubric of what are the kind of don'ts that you would be suggesting people don't do in the context of gaining feedback. I don't know if you want to jump in first.
That's your point is a critical qualification, I think. And obviously you have to pick your moments. Tact and timing and balance and restraint is the key in this, as in most other areas of how one operates professionally. So the last thing you want to do is to give the impression of being needy and constantly being needing reinforcement, because people are looking to you for independent judgment and some courage and even some willingness to take some non-fatal risks from time to time. So that goes back to making sure that you're choosing a question to ask where there really is a judgment call about which people might disagree or that requires experience that you don't yet have, and limiting the number of times that you ask. If you do it right, it builds lots and lots of credibility. But obviously, you can do it too much. I don't know whether Sue agrees with that or not, but let me pause and see what you think.
No, I think that's a great point, Steve, and it's another where you have to be aware of your level, what people would have expected of you at this stage in your career. If you're a pretty senior, even as a practitioner, even if you're running up against something that's unfamiliar to you, there's still an expectation that you're going to try to puzzle through that yourself before you go in and try to get somebody else to tell you how to advance to the next stage. Or they're also not going to expect you to come in and say, how did I do? If I'm a lawyer with 6 or 7 years of experience, I, as a senior lawyer, would hope that you would know how you did, or you'd have some idea. You would instead be coming in to ask me, was this what the client needed? Did we get the result we wanted? How could we have gotten a better result? Those kinds of questions that make it clear that you're a strategic partner to the other person, but yet you're still getting feedback. If you're a very junior lawyer, you definitely are in a position to ask more questions and ask them more frequently, but you have to avoid stalking.
Let me jump in because somebody from the audience had an interesting question. As you're talking about getting feedback from a variety of places, and they asked, what do you think about getting feedback from clients? And so, Sue, you just said, you could, as you're more senior, did we get the result the client wanted? They said, what do you think about getting feedback from the client, and how would you suggest going about it? And I guess if you're a solo, that's a different answer in terms of, or in a small firm, where you really have access to the client, or a larger organization where you might not. What do you do, and is it a good idea?
I mean, I think it's a great idea. You just have to know what the protocol is in your organization. Obviously, if you're in a large firm or even a smaller firm where there's another or senior lawyer perhaps who is the actual client contact, you'd have to talk with the person who's actually the client contact before you made a decision to seek feedback from the client. But if you're in a position, if it's your client or if you're working directly with a client on a regular basis, I think it's a great opportunity to ask, was this the information you needed? Was this helpful? I mean, you don't want to say it in a way that makes you seem as though you're not confident, but you also want to do it with a customer service mindset that I want to know if what I'm giving you is actually useful so that I can direct my time efficiently. And you can even preface your information gathering from the client by saying, either at the end of an engagement, I'd really like to, take a few moments to learn how this went and make sure that our services met your expectations and hopefully exceeded them, and to learn what we could do to make it even more effective next time. If you're on an individual assignment, you can just say, do you feel that the information we've provided is what you need to make your next decision?
Yeah, or might there be a way that you would have preferred to get the information, or, that type of thing, because getting into more what might be feedback also for your skills. I have a question from an audience participant.
Let me just, if I could, add one thing to that, because I agree entirely with the fundamental point, but I think the same mindset is useful for that type of feedback from clients as it is for other types of feedback, and that is you win points and you're likely to elicit better response if you go in having demonstrated that you yourself have given yourself some feedback, perhaps. And again, you're not falling on your sword, you're not demonstrating lack of confidence, but that you've thought through so that the questions are not only did this meet what your expectations, did it give you the information you needed, but perhaps in the right circumstances, I've been thinking that next time, perhaps, etc. That tends to prime the pump, to demonstrate that you have your head in the game, so to speak, and not to make the other person do all the work.
All right, that's excellent. Let's take an audience question, because what this person's going to ask for is specific language that you might use, and what I'd like to pepper in is give us some language that you wouldn't want to use when I ask you the question, something that might demotivate your supervisor from giving you good feedback or spending any time with you on feedback or whatever. So the question comes in just this way. If you're a mid-level transactional attorney at a mid-sized firm and trying to get feedback on a particular contract drafting assignment, so we're in the transactional sphere and we're talking about writing, drafting, please give specific examples of, Sue, you talked about development goals, knowing your development goals, and Steve, a question that this person might use to solicit feedback that would require judgment, a question that would require judgment that this person might use, because we've been talking about that. So quickly, first, Sue, specific examples of your developmental goals if you're mid-level, talking about drafting.
I think if I wanted to state a developmental goal, which I think is a great way to start a request for feedback, I would go into the partner and say, I have set a goal this year to make certain that I am using language that is business friendly, that is user friendly for the client, and that makes sure that I still protect the client with all the appropriate legalese that's needed. But generally, I want my contracts to read in a way that the business people who are going to be working with them will understand them. And so, I'd really like to get feedback on the extent to which I am progressing toward that goal with this particular drafting assignment.
Okay. And now, Steve, specific language they shouldn't use, or what they might exactly say that's going to show that they've, used some judgment in their question at their level.
Well, without repeating what we've been focusing on, and that is going in, making sure that you've thought about the options. So you're asking specific questions about a choice among options rather than just an open-ended, what do I do here? With contract drafting, and I assume if the question comes from somebody in a mid-sized firm, they're probably doing fairly sophisticated commercial contracts, working from precedents that may actually not be all that user-friendly in their present shape. You might, and again, I'm out of my depth here, but you might be thinking there are several ways in which I could deal with a material adverse change clause, depending upon how tight or loose I want the drafting to be. And in this particular situation, my thought is I will draft it this way, but I realize there are other options of tightness and looseness. What do you think is appropriate here? Or I'm trying to draft around the exit strategy in a joint venture or in some other kind of agreement. Here are what I think the key points our clients want in place and how I'm going to draft around those for the exit strategy. But I realize there's another option here. What do you think? That, okay, I think would be one way of going at it.
Okay. The next question from the audience is actually a suggestion, which I want to incorporate as I ask you guys another question that's, really flowing from what you've been talking about. We're assuming that people have, you ask for the feedback or the feed forward or whatever, feed forward, and the person's busy and they can't give you the feedback, or they give you something that's cryptic or harsh, or you think it's unwarranted or it's wrong. You've asked for it, but now you're not happy with what you're getting. And here's the comment from the audience to incorporate too. It says, sometimes no matter when you've asked for the feedback, you put the supervisor on the spot. It's also important to offer that you're open to feedback after they've given some thought to your request. So keeping that in mind, and I think that's a good tip, what if you're getting the feedback, but it's, really upsetting in a number of ways? How do you comport? How do you not? Give some tips, on this thought?
Well, let me jump in, and I agree entirely with the suggestion from the audience. I would just add one more step to that my experience has been, if there's simply an open-ended, if you think of anything else, any other feedback that would be useful, I'd love to hear it. The chances of you actually getting something else are close to zero. In the right circumstances, one way of dealing with that kind of circumstance is actually to set up a meeting without being over elaborate about it. So the person you're going to ask for feedback has some time to think about it ahead of time and knows that at a certain point you'll show up for 10 minutes to talk about it. But in terms of your question, Kathy, getting feedback that seems overly harsh,
yep,
hard to take,
yep,
perhaps even unwarranted. A couple of thoughts there. If in fact the feedback is based upon a factual mistake, you were not actually the person who was falling down drunk at the holiday party, or you didn't actually miss the filing deadline, despite what the person has heard, you obviously need to step up and correct that, and do it not defensively, do it with a smile on your face, do it not aggressively, but correct the factual mistake. However, that's seldom the circumstance. Usually the circumstance is that you're hearing something that seems a little over the top, that doesn't seem entirely fair. And the trick there is, I think, to swallow your sense of injustice, swallow your anger perhaps, and focus instead on what you need to get out of the conversation, which is, among other things, building your reputation by the way you have that conversation, by the way you respond to the perhaps not entirely fair feedback. If you try to get into an argument, debate the issue, you're going to lose. By definition, you're going to lose. And you will not be strengthening the relationship. So that means listening, taking what you hear seriously, asking some questions to drill down, and trying to do that without being defensive about it. And then most importantly, perhaps, suggesting how you propose to respond and the like. It's perfectly okay in those circumstances to say that you'd like to think about this, figure out what to do about it, and you'd love to come back for a second conversation. And that's especially the case if you are, in fact, so upset and so angry by the unfairness of it all that it's hard to respond rationally in the moment.
I like that advice. The thing I would add, is that, just I like the word quick. I'd love to come back for another quick conversation, so they don't think that you're going to come back for a long diatribe about, and present your side of the case and whatnot. This is not a, give and take in that context. You're trying to learn. So I like the advice. I'd help you help your supervisor audience in that way. Sue, quick thoughts on that, and then we're going to go on to our quick tips that we want to also impart.
Yeah, I want to put one other spin on this. Let's say that you had a bad experience in a project and you don't believe it was your fault, but you still want to get feedback on it and you know it's not going to be good. I think in that case you can approach the discussion and set it up by saying, I would like to discuss, this most recent contract that we drafted together and get your thoughts, and I have some thoughts to share on how I think we could do better next time, and I look forward to talking with you. And then when you sit down, the conversation isn't about feedback. The conversation is about how did this project go? It's sort of you're taking it away out of the personal, and to some extent out of the performance, and into a question of how could we work together better? Because usually when you're getting bad feedback from someone, or you can tell the experience isn't going well, that person is not having a good experience. That senior lawyer, that client is not enjoying the experience. And so regardless of how superb your legal work may have been, something wasn't going well, and you need to find out what it was.
Well, here's a question from someone. This gets specific, and I like the question. Let's get a quick answer if we can. What should a person do if you're told to bill all of your time, but then you get feedback for taking too much time on a project?
This is where you have to learn to ask the question. This is where you need Steve's feed forward, because when someone says bill all your time is a great opportunity for you to set parameters on the project by asking one more question and saying, thanks, that's really helpful. Did you have a budget in mind? This kind of a project typically takes me 30 hours. Does that sound about right to you?
Right.
Or this type of project typically takes 5 hours. Does that sound right to you?
And Steve's tip about checking in as you go, right? But to hear this is after the fact and they've already been criticized, how do you, we're going to get to a sort of an agree-disagree. I want this person to hold his question, because we're going to get to this if there's inconsistency and whatnot, because there's going to be. There's a good question for that reason. If you all don't mind, let's jump to our thoughts. We had some quick tips, and I think Sue, first, however it's phrased, take feedback to be commentary on your work rather than on you. Can you talk just a second about that tip?
I think we all have to be self-aware about the fact that we're human beings and we have emotions. We tend to think, that we are doing our very best, we're working our hardest, we're smart individuals, and we're achievement-oriented, and we want to do well. And most people who have finished their law degrees and are practicing lawyers are highly accomplished people who have achieved a lot. There were a lot of A's on those report cards. So we have to remember that, now we're going back to zero. If you're a junior lawyer and just learning to practice, you're not out there as this highly experienced JD. You're there as a brand new person, and the feedback is going to be on the work. Even though it feels personal, it's about the work. It's trying to think of feedback in terms of not whether or not I'm good or bad, but is the work where it needs to be? Are my skills where they need to be? Is my knowledge base growing at the pace that it should be? Not am I a good lawyer or a bad lawyer?
Steve, you've seen a lot of feedback delivered where it's really actually seems like it's a personal, I don't mean directly to you, but to others where it seems personal.
To me too.
And negative. How do you frame that in your head to help yourself, especially in the moment, make sure that you keep your eye on the developmental goal?
Well, it's tough psychologically and emotionally, as Sue said, but I don't know that I've got a magic solution to that. When we do the reverse of this program for people who are in supervisory positions, and I think there's actually a handout for people in that position, we make the same point to them, that they should be focusing on facts, focusing on the objectives, the performance. But people are not good at doing that in law firms. I don't know that I can say anything more than don't worry about how the other person is failing to deliver feedback well. Think about, A, how you are and the way in which you respond in the moment, building your credibility with that person. And B, think about what to do going forward and whether you can weave some of that into the conversation itself. Now, that all said, I realize the frailties of human nature in all of us. And I know in my junior years, I responded very badly to some feedback that I thought was unfair. When I have delivered feedback, I have had people turn red in the face, break down into tears, and so forth, even though, of course, I was doing it impeccably. And if the feedback is just putting you in a terrible frame of mind in the moment, it's perfectly okay to say, going back to our previous point, I hear all this. I take it very much to heart, as you can tell from how I'm responding in the moment. I'd like to go away and think about it and digest it and come back, Kathy Stern, come back and just have another quick conversation about what I propose to do to improve going forward.
And one of the audience members has suggested, that you keep the focus with them on concrete ways to improve, and you be tactful and you be productive, but keep the conversation, showing that you want to improve. How could I do better? So does that get to your tip, Steve, this one, do some of the work of feedback yourself? What does that mean?
Well, I think we've covered three things that it means. Sue made the point that you should have in your head, although you won't always bring it to bear on every feedback conversation, some sense of what your goals are and where particularly you want to focus your development. Secondly, as I've mentioned, you should have given some thought to what you think you could do better. Again, you got to be careful here not to be too self-deprecatory, not to give off vibes of lacking confidence, but that you yourself have given some thought to what you want to do going forward, and that need not be error correction solely. It may not be, I think I could have done this better in the following way. Do you agree? It could be, going forward, I think I could play a larger role in this kind of matter if I did, etc. And then the third concrete piece of this goes back to the point that was made of conceiving feedback as a debriefing, which is an excellent point, because that means you can go into the conversation sometimes with suggestions, questions that go to how the process flows, so to speak, how the team works together, rather than just your own individual performance.
And is that what you mean by this next tip? When it's appropriate, cast the conversation in the future tense. What does that mean?
It means, I think, and again, this is going to get repetitious, I think, if I go into too much depth here, but it means, as we've been saying all along, you really want people thinking as to you, not that you're tremendously worried all the time about getting a grade about what you've done. You're interested in unpacking the specific concrete things you could do better going forward. And that means that as much as possible, you want to make sure that you move the conversation in that direction. Now, given what I'm hearing you say, et cetera, I think next time I could do this.
Well, here, let me ask you this, because one of our listeners asks about, what if you have an extremely autocratic supervisor and there are obviously morale problems that this can cause? And another audience person asks for a little role play. So what if someone says to you as a supervisor, listen, this is really disappointing to me. I really thought at this point in your career you'd be a better writer. I'm looking to work only with the stellar writers in the organization. What do you say? Let's have that conversation. You're obviously going to be, the morale is going to be, kind of tough from that question. You're worried that means they won't ever want to work with you again. So maybe there's not a going forward. You can say if you say, well, next time, they might say, didn't you hear I just said I'm going to work with the stellar writers? What might you say in a tough situation?
Well, I think you can lead by saying, it is my goal to become one of the stellar writers in this firm, and I am working very hard to try to refine my writing skills, and your feedback is very helpful to me, and I want to know more about what separates my work from that of the stellar performers.
Right. Who might you suggest I
give
work
me
with?
Show me why you think my work is subpar to someone who's better. What stands out for you amongst the, what is it in this particular, motion that isn't meeting your needs?
Good. And also, asking about, are there coaches to work with. If I wanted to ask somebody in the office to, help me a little bit on the writing, who would that be? Are there programs outside the office? I mean, I'm willing to put some skin in the game, that kind of thing, just to, take it to the positive and stay focused, as Steve's saying, on the future. And also, as we're talking about with Sue, don't take it too negatively, even if it's terribly negative and personal. But again, Sue, this gets to your last tip. If you get negative feedback, resist defending or blaming.
Well, because it really only matters what that person who's giving you feedback thinks at that moment. The reality of whether you believe you were right or whether you believe what you wrote was the most elegant piece ever is irrelevant. What matters is the person who gave you the assignment thinks A, and we need to find out what A means. What did they experience? Why did it not meet their needs? And what would have made it meet their needs? It's taking yourself out of the sense that this is actually an academic exercise where the best paper wins. It's not. It's an exercise where it's whether or not you meet whatever arcane and sometimes ambiguous set of expectations that a senior lawyer has of someone who's working for them on an assignment they've delegated. But the goal of the real chameleon who can figure it out for each one of those different supervisors who each have different demands, needs, expectations, that's the person who becomes the highly successful person. It's getting in there, figuring out what made this experience not what you wanted it to be, and not focusing on what was wrong with the work or why did you not think it was good, because it's an exercise in futility.
Here's a question, you guys, and then I want to take us over to these agree-disagree, because that might help illuminate, too. She says, do you suggest a junior lawyer spend extra time outside the office to work on a project to catch up with the supervisor's expectations? That might get back to the issue of billing time, but anybody have thoughts on that question?
I think that can be very effective. I mean, I don't recommend that associates spend a lot of time out of the office, working on things non-billable. But let's say you really did go down a rabbit hole in your research, or you really did phone it in on an assignment because you were doing 6 other things and you didn't think it was that important and you thought you could get away with using a template or something that was essentially, just an okay version. Maybe that's a time when you want to show that you're willing to invest your own time in this and not have every minute be billable. That sends a message to a supervisor that you truly are trying to get better and you recognize that maybe the work product you turned in wasn't your very, very best.
Okay, and we're not saying spend time on the case or matter, catching up, doing it over without billing it. We're not saying that, because that's really not.
I'm saying it has to be an isolated situation where, maybe you made a mistake. You went in the wrong direction, or you didn't devote the time you should have to proofing. Or
pay for a program and go to a bar association meeting on the right, Steve? I mean, there are resources.
What I will add to this, although this is very, very tricky terrain, and especially conversations about not recording your time, which varies tremendously from organization to organization to organization. But your self-interest is not going to be perfectly aligned in your junior years with the organization's self-interest. That's just a fact of life. And if you're thinking about developing your skills, go back to the writing example, I think it's a great idea and perfectly legitimate to take upon yourself spending some hours on a draft that you're not going to record, because they are hours devoted basically to developing your drafting or writing skills, not hours devoted to the substance of what you're doing. That's a blurry line, obviously, but investing in your own skill development without putting the time down is a great idea. You just got to be real careful about who knows what you're doing and what discussions you have and the degree to which you're having conversations about what you write down and what you don't write down.
All right, let me change the pace, go to one of our agree-disagree. I think this one is going to be for you, Steve. I'm going to stick with you a minute. Would it be good advice, to give to one of the lawyers on the call to say, try to avoid the word feedback when you seek guidance on your work product? What do you think about that? You
Well,
agree, disagree? Why?
Yeah, no, I agree, but the issue is not so much that it's a bad word or an evil word or all that kind of stuff. It is that the word, as you utter it, almost inevitably carries with it some connotations that may be counterproductive. First of all, I think as one of the questions that came in kind of suggested, a lot of senior lawyers don't like giving feedback. They regard it as awkward and a drain on their time, and you can see them kind of flinching, at least internally, when they hear the word feedback. Oh, once again, I got to go through this. Another connotation is that feedback is presumed to be looking backwards. And as I've said a couple of times, what you really want to do is to look forward. And a third connotation is, at the point has already been made by others, that it's evaluative. If you ask for feedback, the other person is almost automatically going to assume that you're asking implicitly for some kind of grade on how you performed. So it's not fatal to use the word feedback, but I'd find ways of crafting what you're asking for that are forward-looking, that are not evaluative in tone. And it goes back to the question, I've been thinking of some ways I could have done this better. I'd like to run them by you and see what else you think I could do better next time being the key words.
Right, and somebody's asking, but what if you have a supervisor that just never, he or she is known for never giving positive feedback or positive, reinforcement? Can you, as you're saying, look forward and say, well, can you tell me about some of the things that went well, some of the things I could have done differently? I mean, you don't want to be fishing for compliments, but sometimes, it is good to have some of the positive reinforcement. Is it okay to ask for that in an appropriate way?
I actually would be very, very careful about that. And if you do it, it would be, again, teeing up options. When I drafted this or did this or had this conversation, I realized there's two ways of doing it. I chose the following way rather than the other way. What do you think about the way I did it? And one hopes you would elicit, yeah, I thought that was the right way to do it. But if you're dealing with somebody like that, I fear the answer is simply to suck it up.
Yeah.
There's not much you can do about that personality type, especially once they reach a certain maturity, let us say.
Yeah.
And it may be morale damaging, but it's not fatal. And I would just focus upon what you can get out of the working relationship, which may be asking for the kind of work that you want to do, asking for increased responsibility, and just living with the fact that the person is something of an ass.
Well, let me ask Sue something on that point, on the agree-disagree, because, there may be some supervisors that, are not going to be really adept. There may be different people in your organization that give you, different, so to speak, feedback or guidance on the exact same kind of thing. So what about this for advice to our audience? Would you advise them, do you agree or disagree, that they ought to try to reconcile conflicting feedback so they know exactly what the supervisors want from their work? What do you say to that, Sue?
Well, I think you have to be careful to look as though, you want one answer that will answer all questions. I think often you get conflicting feedback because work product or your approach might have been right for one situation, but it was wrong for another situation. So you got positive feedback one time and you got negative feedback another. Even though you feel you did the same thing, what you weren't taking into account was the situational context that may have changed the demands on your skill or knowledge level. And I think it behooves all of us, whenever we're getting comments, and particularly if they are conflicting, to take a step back and listen very carefully and analyze those comments and try to imagine, what is it that was different about my performance in this situation that made it seem, different? Or with this supervisor, I did just fine with supervisor A, but I did terribly with supervisor B. What are the differences there?
Yeah, one of the differences might be the client and what the client might want, and so you might be able to drill down, right?
It could be that on one project there's a terribly demanding client who is, holding the budget over the partner's head and is squealing every time there's an extra hour or he sees the associate's name pop up on the bill, versus the other where, there's a long-standing relationship between the partner and the client. The client trusts the partner to staff the right person and is happy with the associate's work no matter what. So you have a lot of things that may be extraneous to the actual quality of the work product. But it is important for the associate or for whoever is seeking feedback on their work or to better understand conflicting comments to try to take into account the whole picture and learn from it.
Well, let's go to that point, because if we need to get to our takeaways because we're coming up on end of program. But so when you say draft a professional development plan outlining 2 to 3 targeted skills, is this the kind of thing you've kind of been talking about? If you get conflicting feedback from supervisors and you want to focus on understanding that, could that be the kind of thing that would go in a development plan? And how would you word that? But really, really quickly.
How I would word it is to say, I want to make a point in the next 3 months of understanding the context of the assignment that I am taking on in terms of the client demands, the partner's relationship with the client, and any other extraneous information that may have impact on the extent to which everyone will be satisfied with my work.
And the skill might be teamwork, right? I mean, if you want to try to define that as a skill or communication or
it would be
project.
Business savvy would be the skill.
Which one?
Business savvy.
Business savvy. All right, Steve, that was helpful. What about this tip? I think is yours. Look for brief openings to ask for incremental specific feedback. Does that kind of go to this development plan kind of deal, or what does that mean, incremental?
It could easily go to the developmental plan, but it also means just looking for moments on the fly when you can ask a specific question that won't take much time, that's not a burden upon the person who's responding to the question. For example, you've just been in a meeting with a more senior attorney. It's a type of meeting you've not participated in before, or with other people you don't know. Whatever the circumstance, it's new. You're walking down the corridor after the meeting or in the cab coming back. Perfectly okay to say you're debriefing about what went on, to say, I've not been in that group before. Was I talking too much? Was I talking too little? Was I interjecting myself smoothly enough? Any tips about how I should handle myself? Or you've been going hot and heavy on some particular matter flat out for a couple of days, emails bouncing back and forth, lots of conversations. You find yourself having a cup of coffee with the senior person. Perfectly okay to say, am I communicating with you efficiently? Am I sending you too many emails? Would you rather I drop by more, drop by less? Those kinds of questions. Again, don't overdo it, because you don't want to seem a puppy dog, needy. But asking the right question at the right time takes 30 seconds to ask or less, and it takes the other person a minute to answer, and it doesn't have to be a meeting in the person's office.
And someone you trust, too, because somebody asked this question, and we did want to talk about this issue of managing the perceptions, because one partner might think you're dependent, needy, not confident, or a supervising attorney in another kind of organization, and tell another colleague that, and then you start to feel that there's a reputation. Do you ever have to be concerned, you're getting these sort of negative or sort of feedback, and that it's going to start to affect you generally, and kind of how do you deal with that? I know that's a lot to ask in a quick minute at the end of the program, but I think I want to touch on that also as sort of managing the long run.
This is a good question. It's one I get all the time from associates, and I think there's 2 answers. One is that if there is a partner in a firm, for example, who gives consistently negative feedback, the people in learning and development or professional development know who that person is. They know what to anticipate from that individual, and they consider it accordingly. But the other thing to understand is whether or not you're the only person getting negative feedback from that individual, because that's a different story. If this is somebody who grades everybody, tough, then people know he's a tough grader. But on the other hand, if this is someone who's only grading one individual tough, then there's a mismatch between the style of the associate and the partner, or there's a mismatch of the demands of the work and the work product that's coming in. So that requires a deeper conversation, and maybe one that needs to be facilitated by someone in the learning and development group or someone in your professional development group.
Right, or a mentor outside if you don't have that kind of an organization.
Yeah.
Steve, is that, whatever you're going to say it also in this context, because we've got this quick tip to take away, planning and posing questions to facilitate getting, this meaningful targeted input. Can you speak to this negative?
Well,
yeah.
Let me actually. I think we've addressed what I would have said in response to that before. Let me just add on, if I could, to Sue's point, with which I agree entirely. My experience has been, and again, tact and timing matters more than anything else, but with that qualification, my experience has been that if you have some sense that scuttlebutt is developing, you need to address it head on, tactfully. One way of doing that, say you're taking on a new assignment, say to the person with whom you're going to be working, look, I've been kind of hearing that there's some perception building that whatever, and I'd love not to have that perception. I'm not sure it's entirely accurate. I really value your giving me feedback during the course of this assignment as to whether you're seeing that kind of thing or not. I am trying my best to prove that the perception either was wrong or that I've cured what the issue was.
Yeah.
And it's also possible to go back to somebody who you think is the source of that and say, ask for help. Not if the person is an ass, obviously, but ask for help. I understand the perception. I'm trying my best to cure it. I'd love any feedback you have to offer me going forward about whether that's working or not. Show that you're addressing it.
Well, and those are the last two takeaways we have. Being able to plan and pose your questions and demonstrate and discuss that you heard and followed through. So that really helps us. I think, that people need to know that we have a video up that also will give some more information. We have an article about a formal performance review if you want some more information. And we have a whole web page on the programs that have been, that are archived, programs that are coming up. And speaking of that, you can always go to the career site. You can always go to the Career Center site, the Career Advice Live page, and you can even now register for the next program every second Friday of the month. I really want to thank Sue Manch and Steve Armstrong. You've been marvelous, as I knew you would. Thanks for sharing your expertise. And on behalf of the ABA, please wait for your evaluation to come up. I'm Kathy Morris. We thank you all so much for joining us, and I look forward to another future program with you.
Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you.